بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا استعينوا بالصبر والصلاة إن الله مع الصابرين. صدق الله العلي العظيم. O you who believe, seek help from patience and prayer, for Allah is with the patient ones. Doesn't mean that Allah is not with the ones who pray. The people who pray may not be fully into their prayer. They may, once they leave the prayer, like the Khawarij way back, they will cause problems. But if they have the sabr, or the patience with their prayer, then it becomes genuine. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, ma'asabirin, bitasabirin. فإن الصبر من الإيمان كالرأس من الجسد ولا خير في جسد لا رأس معه ولا في إيمان إلا الصبر معه. Imam Ali said that one of the characteristics of sabr could be patience, could be endurance, and other characteristics. He says that endurance is to faith what the body is to the head. What good is a body without the head, the brain, right? What good is it? And what good is faith without endurance? So he meant that if you pray one time and you don't pray again, where's your faith? So faith has to endure. It has to endure. So tonight we're going to be discussing this concept of sabr, which could be, again, patience, endurance, perseverance, constancy, a whole number of different attributes that mean sabr. And it perhaps is the most important virtue that there is, because in anything that you do, the foundation of it, if it's pure, it's a patience, not a wait and see patience. It's not a passive patience. It's not a reactive patience. It's a active, proactive patience. See, the sabr in Islam is not like the patience you're accustomed to, but wait and see. It isn't. It'll give you a good example. Suppose that you're walking and there's a poor person, and a poor person needs help. So as you walk by, so you take whatever's in your pocket, all the money, you give it, and then you go as fast as you can so you don't hear thank you. You don't even want to, even the patient ones don't even want to wait to hear thank you. If they contribute to, say, the institute here, they put that al khair. They don't even want their name anonymous. They don't even want their name to be announced. They do it for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These are the patient. Who are the patient ones? You know, they're very few and far between. But we all have the sabr in us. We just need concentration to bring it out. And it takes deep, deep concentration. And among those that you heard, like we have that we call like sabr ayub, you know, the patience of Job. Prophet Job lived at a time when he was very, very wealthy. He had, thousands of cattle. He had many servants, many children. Then all of a sudden, what happened, the devil challenged God and says, I can turn your most pious servant to the dark side, to the wrong side. So he said, I want to take Ayub, Job, and turn him. So Allah says, fine, go ahead. So there was the test, and by the way, we are all here because of the same test of Sabr Ayub. God put us in existence and gave us the test to see how well we perform, whether we do good or we do bad. Okay? So what happened to Ayub is that he lost his children. And in tandem, another thing comes, another calamity comes, hardship, adversity. He loses his children, then he loses his cattle, then he loses his servants. It goes on and on. He's losing everything. And then one day he wakes up and he has a form of lupus. either elephantitis or leprosy. So his brethren, the Jewish brethren, said, you mock God, blasphemy, so this is what God has done to you. Still, he did not complain. He lost his children, his servants, his cattle. When they accused him of mocking God, Ayub did not complain. The difference between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is the Jews and Christians believe like we do on the patience of God, but they say he complained, he broke down. Islam says he never complained. He always stuck tenaciously with his, what they call metaphysical relationship between him and God. He didn't complain about any adversity or hardship that happened to him. And he always did good and prohibited evil. Well, also we had of the 11th Imam, Imam Hassan al-Askari, was also Imam al-Sabi. In fact, all of the Imams were of the Sabirin. So Muslims throughout the world continue to search for knowledge, search for understanding and wisdom in order to learn as much as they can about the faith of Islam. Now, from time to time, they deter from that cause by falling prey to the desires and evils of this world. See, pomp is play and circumstance. They fall prey to the evils. So what is needed is a stimulus by which they can be assured that their faith will be complete and secure. The stimulus needed to bind the tie between what you call the ideological aspect, between the articles of faith, from Usul ad-Din, and the practical aspects of faith, Furu' ad-Din. And that vehicle that does that is what we call sabr, patience. So the sabr is in my book on patience in Islam. I came up with theory, my theory, and it was approved by even Sunni and Shia scholars. I had to go to Iran to the top or the manager to approve it when I wrote the book on patience. My thing was that the sabr ties the Usul ad-Din with the Furu' ad-Din. It's a linkage because you say in the one a sabr with iman, and the Usul ad-Din you say a sabr with jihad, or sabr with salat, and the Furu' ad-Din. It also ties Ahl al-Bayt with Sunnah al-Rasul. The sabr also ties the mawqif with the suluk, the behavior and the attitude. It also ties the jasad ma'bud, the body and soul. And this is my theory. And that theory, it's not that the Nebi men didn't, of course they did, but there was never anything written about it until I had written back in 1996. So the best example of sabr is when people who are faced with calamity and adversity, faced with hardship, hold steadfast in their sabr and place their trust in Allah. Sabr takes on many characteristics, I said, such as patience, endurance, perseverance, constancy, forbearance. The word sabr and the derivatives occur 103 times and 93 verses in the Holy Quran. So when you read it occurs 70 times, no, it doesn't. I went through it. So the 93 verses and 10 of the verses, it's twice, so 103 times. And the importance of sabr can be understood from the following two passages of the Quran and from Nahj al-Balagha by Imam Ali. From the Quran it says, O you who believe, seek help with patient perseverance and prayer, for Allah is with those who patiently persevere. When I just quoted you, when I put in Arabic, when I began. That's in the Quran, chapter 2, verse 153. So practice endurance, which is sabr, is the faith that the head is to the body, and there's no good in the body without a head, or in faith without endurance. And that's in Nahj al-Balagha, in the 82nd Satan by Imam Ali ibn Talal. Therefore, sabr is the catalyst that brings prayer and faith to self-realization. Because without prayer and faith, without it, prayer and faith are weakened. So sabr guides the dignity of the prayer and ensures that our behavior will reflect the true essence and meaning of prayer. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala stresses the impact and importance of patience, of sabr, by linking it with prayer. Now, in case of faith, Sabr is needed to sustain it. So a body, again, is useless without a head, and it is the brain that is the chief mechanism for sustaining life. Therefore, the body perishes without the head. Likewise, faith is useless without endurance, without sabr, since belief must be sustainable throughout our life. Moreover, when endurance disappears, so does faith. Endurance or sabr, it becomes sustainable, and actionable. Prophet Muhammad and his Ahl al-Bayt have played a major role to instill in the minds of mankind the importance of sabr within the Islamic personality. I will now discuss the importance of sabr within each of the lives of the 15 luminaries of Ahl al-Bayt. That's the 12 Imams plus Nabi Muhammad, Fatima Zahra, and Lady Zainab. Now, and this is my 7th lecture today, but I have written a book already on all that I've discussed in these previous 6, and including this. The book's now gone to the publisher, so you will be getting that book. The reason I didn't tell you before, because I told you you would just wait to get the book, and then you just read the book. But it should be coming to the next 3 months. I'm going to be discussing sabr today, and then I'm going to get into the larger case leadership of Imam Hussein on sabr. I'm not going to have time to discuss with, this is fine. Okay, so I'm not going to have time to discuss some of my other chapters. I also wrote a chapter on the 15 luminaries with relative to the energy, their thought, their energy of each one of them. I also wrote about the unity of each. I also wrote about the oppression and the tyranny that was inflicted upon each of the 15. Okay, and I have to apologize because I have other commitments for the next 3 days that I'm unable to come, otherwise I would have discussed those as well. But you should get it within 3 months anyway. Now let's start on the sabr of Prophet Muhammad. The Prophet endured insults, persecution, and assassination attempts against him. Yet he showed restraint against his enemies. When the Muslims overtook Mecca, the Prophet could have acted with impunity against the enemies, but instead he showed clemency and offered them forgiveness. Prophet Muhammad was the embodiment and personification of sabr, of patience. While he endured many years of suffering, hardships, adversities, and calamities, he always remained steadfast and patient. He was patient with those who waged war against him, as well as with those who killed the companions and family members. He was patient with those who ridiculed, who humiliated, who demeaned, denigrated, and abased him. During the many years of facing all forms of abuse, boycott, and threat on his life, the Prophet remained patient, gentle, and sympathetic, even to his enemies. All through these hardships, he never was discouraged by adverse circumstances, nor did he ever permit any personal desire to overcome him. If we look at the sabr of Fatima al-Zahra, who was the personification of sabr, as she persevered relative to those who did her harm and endured self-restraint against that which she loved. Well, following the death of her father, the Prophet, she demonstrated steadfast patience, sabr. She endured mental anguish and torment from the rulers who denied her the inheritance willed by her father, forcing their way into her home and denying her husband, Imam Ali, of his right to succeed the Prophet as the leader of the Islamic community, of the Islamic Ummah. It was her father who taught his daughter the value of sabr, patience, and forbearance in this life, for she will obtain the eternal reward, of course, in paradise. The political indignation suffered by Fatima teaches us to have faith and patience. Now, sabr is not reactive but proactive. And Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib portrayed the best example of sabr, of patience and endurance. He was the first person to declare in public his support of Prophet Muhammad and belief in the message of Islam. During the gathering of family members, Imam Ali was the first to support the Prophet as his wasi, as his executor and successor. Imam Ali risked his life by sleeping in the Prophet's bed to impersonate him and thwart an assassination plot so the Prophet could escape to safety. Then he left Mecca and went to Medina. During the Battle of the Trench, Imam Ali displayed his sabr, his patience, by restraining his anger as he defeated Amr ibn Abdul Wid, the champion of the enemy. What happened as he beat this guy was like a Goliath, you know, and they would say, oh, you bring your champion and they'll bring our champion, and whoever wins, that's it. Battle's done. So this person, Ibn Wid, nobody can challenge him. And all of a sudden, Imam Ali challenged him, and of course he knew Imam Ali's father. And he said, well, you're the son of Abi Talib, and this and that, you're just a young kid. And I said, no, I challenge you, I challenge you. So he challenged him, and then Imam Ali struck his sword, and he put him on the ground. And before he's going to take the lance and drive it into him, Ahmed ibn Wid from the ground spit at him and did some other unseen things, to which Imam Ali says, I can't kill him now. I have to restrain my anger. So he stepped down and just till he cooled off. Then he finished him off only for the sake of Allah, not for his anger. So he restrained his anger. Now, before the migration to Medina, Imam Ali exhibited sabr and endurance as he shared with the Prophet all the persecutions and bore most of his hardships. The hardships of the Prophet. When the Prophet appointed Imam Ali to be his successor as caliph was rejected by some of the companions, Imam Ali patiently endured 24 years before he was restored his right to be caliph. His steadfastness and his resolve removed any obstacles, for example, fear, as he faced danger and hardship with the greatest intensity of sabr. The life of Imam Hassan ibn Imam Ali was one of hardships, trials, and deception. But through all of these events, he never wavered from his sabr, from his patience. He remained steadfast even with the tragedies within his family. Mother was brutally injured and dying at a young age, martyrdom of his father, substitution of Islam by some for wealth and power, and some of his supporters turning against him. You know, Muawiyah bought off these people. You know, that Imam Hassan had a lot of supporters, but then Muawiyah went and bought them off. See, they compromised their values in Islam. They allowed themselves to be bought. So, however, Imam Hassan endured each of these, although sad and distressed. In order to spare bloodshed and war, he signed a treaty with Muawiyah. Nevertheless, Muawiyah did not comply with any of the terms of the treaty, and instead nominated his son Yazid as his successor and ruler of the Islamic Ummah. So Muawiyah had Imam Hassan poisoned by Imam Hassan's wife to clear the path for Yazid. Undoubtedly, the theme of Karbala, was sabr. As Imam Hussein stood firm and did not compromise, did not compromise his principles. Can there be a greater example of sabr than what Imam Hussein endured? His children, brothers, and companions were brutally slain before his eyes as they fought off the ruthless and merciless army of Yazid, while he himself fell in a hail of enemy arrows, swords, and daggers, while prostrating before Allah. Imam Hussein was the essence of sabr, as he was firm in his purpose, maintained his consciousness of Allah, just like Sabr Ayyub did, and chose the Sirat al-Mustaqim, the straight path, leading to his ultimate sacrifice to save Islam and monotheism. The most important incident that took place at Karbala wasn't even the decapitating or the beheading of the martyrs. The most important incident that you want to understand is when the enemies cut off the water supply. They cut off the water. The water was a branch that came from the Euphrates River. They cut off the water, and Ali al-Zahir, like Abdullah Ali al-Zahir, the son of Imam Hussein, was denied water. A 6-month-old infant was denied water and, of course, shot the arrow into him. Why is that such the most important incident that happened? You must remember. We use the word juxtaposition. That means you put something side by side and you have a spatial relationship. What does that remind you of? It reminds you of Ishmael and his father, Nabi Ibrahim, when they went to Mecca, and Hagar, being the mother of Ishmael, go Safa and Marwa 7 times in the scorching sun. There was no water. And you have a baby now. Just think of Ali Zahir. Now you have a baby, Ishmael, who wants water, and there's no water. Then all of a sudden, his feet, he's with the sand, playing the sand, all of a sudden the water came from Allah. See, the water, then you got Zamzam. And Zamzam is like in about a diameter of 9 feet, about 98 feet deep. But there's no linkages elsewhere. Where does it come from? And it's always filled. No matter how many millions of people drink the water of Zamzam, it's always filled. Always to the brim. So the juxtaposition between the two, here was an infant who was thirsty in Mecca, being Ishmael, and here's an infant, Ali Zahir, who was thirsty in Karbala. And why is the greatest crime? Because Allah, that they did this now against Allah. Allah provided us with water as our lifeblood. So when they cut the water off, and especially from the infant, this was the worst crime that was committed. So Imam Hussein, what did Imam Hussein leave at Karbala? He left the example of prayer with sabr. You know, when he was praying, the enemies like Hur and some of the ones they just got overwhelmed by this holiness of prayer. They came back to Imam Hussein. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Hur was the first one to fall. And all of them were beheaded and decapitated and so forth. And it wasn't 70. You know, if I remember, I think there were 138, of which 8 died in Kufa, and there must have been, so we say it's over 100 that died in Karbala. And who were some of the ones that died with the Hussein? And the travesty is that people don't mention who they are. Well, let me just tell you who some of them are. I think there were 3 named Yazid, who were good Yazids, that were in the camp of Hussein, and 2 of them, the Nabi Muhammad had extolled their virtues to be legitimate. Then there were Abu Bakr and Uthman, the half-brothers of Hussein. You know, when Fatima Zahra died, then Imam Ali married. And when he married others, he had 3 sons, Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman. He actually named them those three. And then his son, Imam Hassan, had Abu Bakr and Umar. Imam Sajjad had Umar. Imam Musa al-Kazim had Aisha, of course, the 34th child, but he had Aisha. And you know why that's done? Because Imam Ali knew, and they knew, this is what they're imams, they knew in the future you have to fit that. And how are you going to bring them together? See, Imam Ali set the stage that he had no hatred for these people. He was disappointed in the companions. He did not hate them. Okay? And they died. So when I went to the shrine in Karbala and I see the coffin inside the cave, some of you might have been there, and you got the khatta on it, right? And it has the names. But there's no names listed outside because they will have to name Abu Bakr and Uthman, not Umar, Abu Bakr and Uthman are the brothers, half-brothers, as well as Abu Bakr, the son of Imam Hassan, and then you have a couple of Umars in there, and a few Yazids in there, and you have all these other people in there. So, if Talal is evil, doesn't mean all the Talals in the world are evil. So unfortunately, Yazid was such a bad person that he obliterated and erased the names of the other Yazids who were good people. That's unfortunate, but that's what happened. So, the example of Imam Hussein was one of prayer. And his perseverance in prayer, his sabr in prayer, at Karbala was a light that drew even some of his enemies to his side. It's important to understand that it was the prayer that Imam Hussein was safeguarding. And it is sabr that ensures the endurance of prayer throughout our lives. Now, like her mother, Lady Zainab also personified the essence of sabr. Through all the adversities she and her family suffered, she remained steadfast and patient in her worship of Allah. Her sabr was an act of worship, the highest level of worship, as she exhibited her resolve, even though she had been mentally abused and harassed as a captive of the evil, malicious, and illegitimate ruler Yazid. She was proactive in her sabr, as she steadfastly supported her brother Imam Hussein in the field of Karbala, protected her nephew Imam Sajjad from being killed, and continued to propagate the tragedy of Karbala in the years that followed. Lady Zainab was able to convince a whole new generation of Muslims to the way of Ahlul Bayt. Her powerful and influential sermons in Kufa and Damascus aroused the hands of his enemies. But at no time did he ever arouse the hand of the ignorance of the people who were deceived by the tyranny of Yazid and Ziyad. You know, when if you look at the triangle, it's a triangle, and here at the bottom you have Imam Hussein, on this side you have Lady Zainab, and on this side you have Imam Sajjad. Okay, so the objective of Hussein was revolt, and the objective of Sid Zainab was to admonish those who were basing Islam, and the objective of Imam Sajjad was to reawaken the people. No longer philosophy in Islam. You got to get into the basics because prayer was being challenged. Okay, so these three together is what protected Islam. You cannot discuss one without discussing the other two. And it was Sid Zainab, more than anyone, who kept it alive. How was it that she could paralyze Ibn Ziyad in Kufa and Yazid in Damascus from killing Imam Sajjad? How could she have paralyzed it with her eloquence of speech? It had to come from Allah. Which means, was she ma'asuma? I mean, how could she have done? Nobody else could do it. But she did it. And so she exercised the self-restraint in the midst of the most ominous calamity, the tragedy of Karbala. Here she demonstrated the practical meaning of sabr, even in the midst of all those painful and heinous scenes at Karbala when members of her family and followers were gruesomely martyred. Imam Ali Sajjad exhibited a great deal of patience relative to his enemies. Following the tragedy of Karbala, he endured very difficult times in the hands of his enemies, but at no time did he ever display signs of anger or impatience. Rather, he responded to his enemies bravely without showing any wrath or loss of sabr. After patiently bearing the tragedies on the plains of Karbala, Imam al-Jad continued to endure in a society confronted with absolute chaos and disorder, as the sufferings of the people were intensified under the rule of the Umayyad regime. The Imam spent the rest of his life giving lectures in the masjid of the Prophet and patiently wrote his supplications to Allah, his dua, which were later compiled in a book and became known, as the Psalms of the Imam al-Sajjad. It's a collection of supplications or psalms and even whispered prayers. The life of Imam Muhammad al-Baqir, the son of Imam al-Sajjad, was filled with turmoil and persecution of the followers of Ahl al-Bayt. Unable to take part in the political movements to oppose the Umayyad regime, he had to endure his silence with pain and distress. So you're under complete surveillance by the Umayyads. They had secret agents monitor every move that he made, every discussion that he had, every utterance that he gave. And during the time of patience, the Imam prospered the Islamic civilization as he made great inroads into the field of science, jurisprudence, philosophy, theology, and medicine. It was Imam Muhammad al-Baqir that was the original teacher of Abu Hanifa and Malik. Then his son, Imam Ja'far, takes over. So Imam Muhammad al-Baqir's contributions in these fields of study were immense and set the template for his son, Imam Ja'far Sadiq, to follow. So with sabr, Imam Muhammad al-Baqir endured the many painful events in order to pursue his achievements in these fields of study. Now, during his life, the society was in complete disarray, and the people were subject to oppression and persecution and imprisonment, as well as torture and death, martyrdom. So the Umayyads took every opportunity to disparage and belittle the Imam's grandfathers by cursing them openly on pulpits and in the mosque. They followed what Muawiyah had done earlier to blast and condemn and demean and denigrate Imam Ali. And this is what the Umayyads were doing, the following caliphs. So as he had to remain patient, the Imam restrained his anger. Now, Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq was the most patient and tolerant teacher of his time, as each day he would patiently listen and reply to his students, such as the celebrated Sunni scholars of Abu Hanifa and Malik, on the topic of theology and Islam. He even taught them mathematics, he taught them chemistry as well, not just theology. His forbearance and his fortitude relative to the hardships and difficulties he experienced are a true measure as to the extent of his energy and faith. How he dealt with these difficulties was a result of his patience. No matter how much his enemies harassed, abused, and tormented him, he showed patience and forbearance. Although the Imam would admonish them, he would never curse or use foul language. Regarding his relations with people, the Imam was extraordinarily forbearing and patient. When someone did him wrong, he would pray to Allah to forgive that person. Best example of patience. Imam Musa al-Kadhim had the highest standards of morality and ethical behavior. His patience and forbearance were the virtues that restrained his anger, as he forgave all who inflicted harm on him. He exhibited the highest level of patience in the face of oppression and adversity, right to the very end when he was martyred in prison. He was given even kind to those who harassed him. Kind to those who harassed him. The Imam endured all the atrocities with his perseverance, patience, and courage. It was his sabr that enabled him to contain his sorrow, to contain his pain, to contain his suffering. He was virtuous, he was generous. He helped the poor and the afflicted in Medina with the necessities of life, such as food, clothing, and shelter. In a complete state of sabr, he devoted his nights to prayer and his days to fasting. Now, the eighth Imam, Imam Ali al-Rida, presents a very interesting example. As I said, he took the cause of Imam Hussein and Imam Hassan. Imam Hassan for peace and Imam Hussein for revolt. At the same time, simultaneously. How could someone do it? But he did. So the strength of Imam Ali al-Rida becomes manifest when we examine the political persecution from which he suffered, the degree of agony, the amount of grief and sorrow that filled his heart. The Imam was aware that the allegiance offered by Caliph Ma'mun was the allegiance of death. He was under the sentence of death if he did not accept to be heir apparent, and he was under sentence of death if he did accept. His patience was the foundation upon which he could buy time to avoid a new wave of terror, exile, and execution against the followers of Ahlul Bayt. So when he accepted, Ibn Ma'mun was in his 30s, and Imam Ali al-Rida was in his 50s. He was twice his age. So he had to accept to be the successor to Ma'mun, which would never happen, but he had to accept it in order to buy time so he can get to the intellectuals of the society and tell them about Ahlul Bayt and strengthen Ahlul Bayt. To communicate, to interact freely and safely on the basis of the principle of Nas, that's designation of an Imam by a previous Imam. So all during his patience, the Imam was under surveillance and his conversations and letters were controlled. He lived in the same painful conditions as Imam Hassan ibn Abi Talib without being able to explain his ordeal to the people, not even to many of his confidants. He had to suffer martyrdom every day, protecting those who he loved and defended with his life, while they misunderstood and misinterpreted his actions. His own family, relatives, cousins misinterpreted what he was doing. This was the greatest test of patience he endured as he was isolated from the people closest to him, sad and distressed, even when difficult decisions were made without being able to explain the reasons. He had a course to follow, and that was the strength of Ahlul Bayt to save them from extermination. When Imam Muhammad al-Jawad, the ninth Imam, moved to Medina with his wife, the daughter of Caliph Ma'mun, he restrained his frustration by enduring patiently with a constant nagging wife. As a spoiled princess, she constantly complained about the restrictions imposed on her to live a simple life of humility and self-denial, the same lifestyle that wives of other imams had lived. She was unable to bear children. That was a godsend. She was unable to bear children, which backfired on Ma'mun, who wanted a grandson so he could enter to the door of Ahlul Bayt. As she was unable to convince her father about the difficult life she had with Imam Jawad, she did, however, convince the new caliph, Mu'tazim, who conspired with her to poison the Imam. Caliph Mu'tazim had a deep envy and hatred of the Imam and Ahlul Bayt. Imam Jawad had taken a second wife who bore him Imam Ali al-Hadi, who becomes the next Imam, and other children. So with sabr and perseverance in his spirituality and knowledge, the Imam taught and counseled many students and scholars who benefited a great deal from the teachings in a number of fields. Imam al-Hadi, the 10th Imam, endured all hardships for the sake of giving knowledge to those who sought it. Caliph Mutawakkil knew that, and he continued oppressing the Imam's followers. Except for Imam al-Mahdi, Imam Ali al-Hadi's 34 years of imamate was the longest of any other imam. But guess what? He spent 17 years of freedom and 17 years under arrest. In spite of his 17 years of imprisonment, his Sabbath gave him strength as he passed his time in wardship. Steadfast in his patience, he endured 6 caliphs, 6 of them. Now, the oppressive Abbasid government imprisoned Imam Hassan al-Askari, the 11th Imam. Often the jailers would find themselves in awe as they witnessed the piety and patience of the Imam. Time after time, the jailers and their reinforcements would find themselves in a state of grace and faith as they witnessed the Salah of the Imam. Enraged, the Abbasids placed a bunch of wild animals that hadn't eaten for days into the cage with the Imam. When the Abbasids came back, they were spellbound as they found the Imam steadfast in prayer and the wild animals hovered around him in prostration. Even the animals prostrated. So Imam Hassan was from the most patient people. He always suppressed his anger and treated whomever did him wrong with kindness and forgiveness. Even in his imprisonment, he remained steadfast and patient, as he did not complain about his suffering. Rather, his reliance was on one of prayer and Allah, to Allah. Now, the minor occultation and the major occultation, Ghaibat al-Zuhra wa Ghaibat al-Kubra, of Imam al-Mahdi, helped him bear with patience the difficult times throughout the centuries. Now, with patience and endurance, he has witnessed the many tragedies of life that include calamities, famine, wars, tyranny, oppression, injustice, genocide, maybe the Holocaust of the Jews, the millions of people in Rwanda that suffered recently, died with malnutrition, no water, no food. I mean, all of these he's witnessed over. Nobody witnessed anything more than Imam al-Mahdi. He's witnessing now homosexuality on the rise, same-sex marriage, agnosticism, atheism, and so forth, a multitude of other deviations. Now, upon the awaited arrival of Imam al-Mahdi with Prophet Jesus, the triumph of the Imamate culminates in a victory of good over evil, freedom over oppression, and justice over injustice. Unlike the previous infallible Imams that followed up with details relative to the message, Imam al-Mahdi is Allah's decisive victory to make good, freedom, and justice triumph in the world. Second set. Take 10 minutes. Now I want to give you the case example of leadership and character, which is Imam al-Hussein. In the year 680, leadership was put to the test during the period of Caliph Yazid's illegal rule. Imam Hussein, the grandson of Prophet Muhammad and son of Imam Ali and Fatima, fought and died for the protection and preservation of Islam. To him, Islam was not only threatened, but on the verge of collapse and destruction. But threatened by whom? Many scholars believe it was a fight against the tyrant and corrupt Yazid and his followers. A more in-depth analysis reveals that Imam Hussein's underlying mission was to put an end to those who compromised their Islamic values and ideals. What was compromised was the very essence of Islam, for Muslims had fallen back into the depths of ignorance. What led up to Imam Hussein's martyrdom is a tragedy, the story that has been repeatedly recounted over the centuries. For Imam Hussein, he had lived under the most difficult external circumstances of oppression and persecution. From the time of the death of Prophet Muhammad, his grandfather, Muawiyah, the father of Yazid, and his followers made use of every possible scheme to destroy and dispose of Ahl al-Bayt and thus obliterate the name of Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib and his progeny. Imam Hussein took over the leadership of Islam following the martyrdom of his brother Imam Hassan. This was the time when Imam Hussein, to make public his authority and to fulfill his jihad, his struggle for the cause of justice, which resulted in his own martyrdom. Muawiyah, as I said before, had broken the truce he had with Imam Hassan by taking severe measures to implement his own plan. that of strengthening the basis of the Caliphate for his son Yazid. During that time, Imam Hussein had to endure every kind of mental and spiritual anguish and suffering from Muawiyah, Yazid, and their followers. With deception and fraudulent means, Muawiyah gained the support of Muslims who pledged their allegiance to Yazid. Muawiyah, who did not impose this requirement upon Imam Hussein, had advised his son Yazid not to force the issue. But Yazid did not listen, as he continued to pursue Imam Hussein with impudence and treachery. Yazid's character was tantamount equal to that of the devil himself. Unrelenting, Yazid caused all kinds of disruption and interference in the precepts of Islam, as he practiced every malevolence and evil with the highest degree of insolence. With determination and a zeal for justice, Imam Hussein will not give his allegiance to Yazid's injustice and tyranny. For Imam Hussein, he had to confront oppression and despotism by spreading the message of truth and justice to the Muslim Ummah. In order to safeguard the sanctuary of the holy place of Mecca from war, Imam Hussein decided to leave Mecca and proceed to Iraq. In Kufa, Iraq, the people pledged their allegiance to Imam Hussein by promising and guaranteeing him their trust and contract. However, the people of Kufa later broke their pledge and deserted the Imam. Karbala was a town located in the desert about 50 miles from Kufa. Here is where the battle for truth and justice took place. The army of Yazid numbered in the thousands, and they surrounded Imam Hussein and a small contingent of followers. The event at Karbala lasted 10 days. Imam Hussein and his followers remained steadfast, while the enemy's army continued to increase with more thousands of soldiers. However, on the 7th day, the water supply was cut off from Imam Hussein's camp. Now began the torture of thirst and hunger. The Imam strengthened his resolve as he informed his companions that martyrdom was inevitable. Many of his companions dispersed, and what was left was a small contingent of less than 100 devout Muslims that remained loyal. On the 9th day, the last challenge was made by the enemy to Imam Hussein to choose allegiance or war. Imam Hussein refused allegiance and became determined to enter battle on the next day, the 10th day of the month of Muharram, which was known as Ashura. At Karbala, Imam Hussein fought and died for the sanctity of Islam. The Imam and his companions fought until they were all martyred. Among those killed were 2 children of Imam Hassan, who were only 11 and 13 years old, a 5-year-old child and a baby of Imam Hussein. The bodies of the martyrs were decapitated and denied burial. Imam Hussein was the essence of sabr because he was firm in his purpose, maintained his consciousness of Allah, and was guided by Sirat al-Mustaqim, the straight path, leading to his ultimate sacrifice to save Islam. What Imam Hussein left at Karbala was the example, and the very essence of that example was prayer. His perseverance in prayer at Karbala was a light that drew even some of the enemies to his side at that time. When Imam Hussein and his tiny contingent were in prayer, some of the opposition, such as the well-known soldier Hud, was so drawn to the true believers that they crossed over and joined them. It's important to understand that it was the prayer that Imam Hussein was safeguarding, because Hajj and fasting and charity and all these other things had been destroyed. Make no mistake about this. The enemies of Karbala also prayed. Nabi Muhammad was asked, how could Islam be destroyed? When prayer is destroyed, Islam is destroyed. But the prayers by the enemies were null and void. Can one pray and then proceed to murder the grandson of Prophet Muhammad? No. So you see, even prayer was distorted by these enemies. And the reason was that the enemies lacked sabr in their prayer. And he had fallen from the straight path. Just like the Khawarij did with Imam Ali. They prayed for maybe 8 hours, maybe 8 hours straight, 1,000 rak'ahs a day. And he said calluses on their forehead. But when they left the prayer room, they were evil mischief makers. They would create all kinds of problems in society. They didn't have salah. So Imam Hussein's message is for the people not to compromise Islam and to realize that one's salvation is through the practice of salat and prayer. The symbol of prayer was so dynamic and powerful that it was the means by which the continuation of the root of Imam Hussein followed. And that continuation was Imam Hussein's son, Imam Ali al-Sajjad. So seeking knowledge, understanding, and wisdom, or striving toward prosperity and tranquility cannot be meaningful without the security of a foundation of prayer, of faith. And the foundation of faith is salah, prayer. So in conclusion, while it is important to seek knowledge and understanding, these needs are nurtured in self-awareness once prayer is solidified. Imam Ali al-Sajjad was a leader of prayer, prostration, and supplication, and he restored Islam by these means. It was Imam al-Sajjad who continued the cause of Islam that his father had courageously died for. The Muslim world had to be reawakened to Islam, and it was Imam al-Sajjad who successfully restored the Muslims back to the straight path, to Sirat al-Mustaqim. How he did this was again by example, by prayer, the root essence of Islam. His numerous prayers and supplications are recorded in volumes of books, and they are the standard for all Muslims to follow. So what is the message of the imamate? The centuries following Imam Hussein's martyrdom saw Muslims time and time again compromising their Islamic values and ideals. Whether with the Umayyads or with the Abbasids, or in contemporary times today, we note that Islam for Muslims is being threatened throughout the world. Many Muslim countries, for example, grant fewer religious freedoms to their subjects than do leaders of Western nations. But the problem here is deep-rooted. It is a problem of the Muslims themselves. In order to assimilate into the mainstream of non-Islamic society, Muslims often feel it is necessary to forgo their Islamic traditions, their lifestyles, and behavior in order to be accepted by that society. So they compromise. These Muslims have fallen into the lowest form of degradation, for they have substituted Islam for convenience and social compatibility. So let us reflect on the martyrdom of Imam Hussein and the martyrdom of the other infallible imams so we can learn from their example. What we learn is that Imam Hussein carried out the legacy of his grandfather, Prophet Muhammad, and his father, Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib. It is a legacy that truth must prevail over evil, injustice, tyranny, and deviation. It is a legacy that faith must overcome disbelief. It is a legacy that Muslims must fulfill all obligations. Remember that Islam cannot be compromised. To know whether or not we have compromised Islam requires that we have knowledge of at least the basic fundamentals of Islam. And that's why people like Sheikh Hisham teaches you what the basic principles are, so then you become a much fuller Muslim. This requires an understanding of what Islam is and what it is not. We must submit our will to Allah, become certain of our faith, believe in Imam Hussein's message, and accept the challenge that we will strive in the way of Allah to better ourselves as Muslims. We must be steadfast and actionable in our obligations to Islam. We must display the right attitude so that our faith can endure. We must let our behavior be one of others to follow, and above all, we must have the sabr to be patient. We shall fulfill all obligations in order to strengthen our Islamic personalities, whether they are divine obligations in pleasing Allah as we pray and fast, or whether they are moral obligations such as avoiding backbiting and suspicion, or whether they are mutual obligations such as keeping the promise relative to a marriage contract, or whether they are tacit obligations such as empathy, gestures, intuitions, attitudes, and behavior. We should fulfill them by our dhikr, by our remembrance of Allah, and by our actions. Developing a strong Islamic personality that is nurtured in the ideals of outer and inner cleanliness helps fulfill these obligations. It's not enough just to pray and fast. We have to make our prayers and fasting actionable by fulfilling all obligations. Each of us is responsible for fulfilling our own individual obligations by purifying ourselves and creating a healthy body and mind so that the soul may return to Allah. Trials of wealth, trials of power, trials of authority, trials of courage test our resolve. whether they are trials of ease or of hardship. Only those who have understanding and whose hearts are filled with faith can remain steadfast. And the foundation for fulfilling our obligation is unity, and that is the message of Prophet Muhammad as an imam. As the Quran says, and hold fast altogether by the rope which Allah stresses out through hablillah, and be not divided among yourselves. And it is the hablillah, the rope of Allah, that we cling to in order to walk Sirat al-Mustaqim, the straight path. For it is the path of the soul. As Muslims, we should invoke our blessings, salawat upon Prophet Muhammad and the Imam to show our appreciation for their guidance, knowledge, and wisdom. Salawat ala Nabi Muhammad. Thank you. The name of my book that's going to come out is Know and Follow the Straight Path. A'rif wa atba, Sirat al-Mustaqim. So inshallah you will have it in 3 months. In English, it'll be translated.